So, if I had to pinpoint when things started unraveling, I'd say it was a little over a year ago. Funny thing is, I honestly thought Lila and I were solid. We weren't perfect. Who is? But we'd been together for almost 7 years, and she'd always been steady, dependable even. But then, little things started to change, subtle shifts that felt like sand slipping out from under my feet. At first, I brushed it off, figured maybe she was just focused on self-care or something. I didn't want to be the hovering husband, questioning every little thing she did. Looking back, though, maybe I should have trusted my gut a whole lot sooner. The first change was in her routine. Lila had always been predictable, almost to the minute. She'd hit the gym in the morning, spend the afternoon with errands or friends, and we'd have dinner together in the evening. Then, suddenly, she was leaving earlier, coming home later, claiming she needed more time for herself. I thought, sure, we all need our space. But this wasn't just occasional. It became her new normal. She'd be out before I'd even had my first coffee, and some nights she wouldn't be back until long after I'd had dinner on my own. One evening, she came home with a shopping bag, a high-end jewelry brand, no less. I remember teasing her, saying, "Did you get a raise at work or something?" She just laughed it off, saying she was treating herself. That's when my suspicions first kicked in. Lila, the same woman who used to cut coupons and wait for sales, suddenly splurging on designer handbags, perfumes, and jewelry? Something didn't add up. I tried to brush it aside, but it weighed on me. I found myself thinking, who is this woman bringing home luxury items and clothes by the bagful? I'd never seen her spend on herself like that. Not once in all the years we'd been together. Even my sister, Nicole, couldn't ignore the change. She'd come by for dinner or just to catch up, and I'd catch her giving Lila these suspicious side glances whenever she'd pull out a new accessory. One night, Nicole pulled me aside and asked, "Daniel, what's going on with Lila? She's acting different." I didn't have an answer. What could I say? That my wife suddenly seemed like she had a whole other life? But Nicole's comment stuck with me. I started paying closer attention, noticing things I'd been brushing off. Then there was Marge, our neighbor. Now, Marge is nosy, no question about that, but in hindsight, I'm actually thankful for it. One day, she casually mentioned that she'd seen Lila at different cafes and restaurants with some guy. She didn't say much more, just tossed it out like it was nothing. Lila and some guy. I brushed it off with Marge, not wanting to leap to any wild conclusions, but my mind was spinning. What was Lila doing with another man? That's when I really began paying attention. One night, after she'd fallen asleep, I went through our joint account statements, and there it all was, plain as day. Charges for massages, spa treatments, and fancy lunches, all at places she'd never mentioned. Here's the kicker. Lila never even liked massages. It was like seeing my marriage laid out in a series of receipts and charges that didn't make sense. I'd lie awake at night, staring at her while she slept, wondering if I was losing it, if maybe I was imagining things. Was she just blowing off steam? Or was there something more going on? I started feeling like I was coming undone, my mind spiraling with all kinds of scenarios. Some were stupidly innocent. Maybe she just made new friends or was splurging for the sake of change. But my mind kept wandering back to darker possibilities. Was she hiding something from me? Living a double life I had no clue about? And the worst part? I couldn't bring myself to confront her directly. How do you even ask, "Hey, Lila, are you cheating on me?" It sounded insane, and honestly, a part of me didn't want to believe it could be true. After a few days of keeping my suspicions to myself, I finally decided to ask her about these supposed massages. Maybe I was jumping to conclusions, but I had to know. One evening, after she got home, I brought it up casually, saying, "You've been spending a lot of time at those massage places. Huh? Must be relaxing." I tried to keep it light, but I saw her freeze, just for a second, before forcing on this overly bright smile. She brushed it off, saying it was just for relaxation, nothing worth discussing. Not worth discussing. That hit me wrong. Since when had she ever been so secretive about something as simple as a massage? And her tone, it wasn't just dismissive. It was like she was daring me to push further. I dropped it for the time being, but inside, my suspicions were spiraling. I was done giving her the jackafit of the doubt. The next day, still fuming, I ran into Ethan, a solid guy and mutual friend who works at a bank. I don't know what got into me, but after a few beers, I just unloaded the whole story. The sudden spending, her odd behavior, the way she'd become defensive. Ethan listened quietly, nodding with that serious look of his. When I mentioned the joint account transactions, his expression tightened, and he offered to dig into it. Nothing crazy, he said. Just, I'll see if anything stands out. A few days later, he called. From the tone of his voice, I knew he'd found something. Turns out, those supposed massage payments were linked to some shady accounts I'd never heard of. Definitely not legitimate massage services. He didn't say much, just sent me the info and told me to keep my eyes open. Around that time, I met a new guy at work, Adam. It's funny how life throws people at you at just the right time. Adam mentioned in passing that he'd gone through a rough patch with his wife. When I asked, he shared more, telling me how she'd been seeing someone else and how he'd pieced it all together. Then he looked me straight in the eye and said, "Look, if you're having doubts, don't ignore them. Sometimes you gotta bring in a pro." That's when I realized I couldn't just sit around, playing guessing games. I needed answers. I was tired of the constant gnawing dread in my stomach, of wondering if I was just being paranoid. So, a few days later, I met with Lucas, a private investigator Adam recommended. Lucas was all business, calm, collected, no questions asked. I laid it all out for him. The bank statements, the odd charges, the way she'd become a stranger. He nodded, taking notes. "I'll be discreet," he promised, "but I'll get you answers." What followed was one of the longest, most agonizing weeks of my life. Every time she walked out the door, every time my phone buzzed, my stomach churned with a mix of hope and dread. I didn't know if I wanted to be right or wrong. Then, finally, Lucas called. He had something for me, he said. We met in a dingy little cafe, and he slid an envelope across the table. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were photos, a whole stack, each one a gut punch. There was Lila, sitting across from some guy, her hand on his arm. They were leaning close, too close, laughing and smiling. A look on her face I hadn't seen in months. It wasn't just friendly, it was intimate. And then, Lucas handed me a USB drive, his face unreadable. "This one," he said, his voice low, "you might want to sit down for." Later that night, I watched the video. There she was, arm in arm with this guy, Marco, the so-called masseuse, walking into a hotel, looking as comfortable as if they belonged there together. I didn't need to see what happened next. That was enough. The reality hit me harder than any punch could. I sat there, feeling like the ground had dropped out from beneath me. It was surreal, like I was watching someone else's life come crashing down. My fists clenched, every muscle tense with anger and pain that felt as raw as an open wound. She'd lied to me so easily, so casually, it made me sick. All those late nights, those me-time outings, the sudden splurges, they weren't for herself. They were all for him. Rage flared inside me, but Jackith, it was a wound that felt deeper than any I'd known. All our happy memories flashed through my mind, but now they seemed shallow, cheap, like a staged show I'd been forced to watch. I couldn't get the image of her with him out of my head. It twisted in my gut like a knife, but that pain quickly turned cold, numbing me. That night, I pulled out every photo I could find of us, every holiday, birthday, trip we'd taken together. Looking at those pictures felt like I was watching some stranger's life, some poor fool who'd trusted the wrong person. I couldn't reconcile the woman smiling beside me in those photos with the one sneaking off to hotels with another man. As I sat there, that bitterness simmering, a new idea began to form. I wasn't going to let her get away with it. She'd taken everything. My trust, my loyalty, my love, and made a mockery of it all. I couldn't forgive that. I'd never been one for revenge, but after seeing her walk into that hotel with Marco, it was the only thing that felt like it could bring me any peace. Lila had played me for a fool, and each time I thought about it, that bitterness solidified into something darker. I knew exactly when I would confront her, our anniversary. She turned our marriage into a joke, so I figured I'd return the favor. For the next few days, I kept my distance, keeping my tone casual, pretending nothing was wrong. She looked almost smug, like she thought she'd fooled me completely. Meanwhile, I was busy behind the scenes, collecting every shred of evidence I had. The photos, bank statements, receipts for those so-called massages. I was going to make sure there was no way she could wriggle out of this when the time came. Then came the next step. I confided in people I trusted, enough to cover my bases. My brother Aaron was the first person I went to. He'd never been Lila's biggest fan, and when I told him about the affair, he just shook his head, that mix of pity and frustration clear on his face. "Don't hold back," he said. "She's made a fool of you, man. Do what you need to." Aaron didn't mince words, and for once, I appreciated his bluntness. He was all in, ready to back me up however I needed. I also reached out to Julia, one of Lila's close friends. I hadn't expected her to take my side, but Julia had always been honest and a little blunt, and she'd suspected something too. I told her what I knew, leaving out the revenge plan, of course, and hinted that Lila might have been hiding things. She looked shocked, but there was a knowing look in her eyes. Well, she's not who you think she is," Julia said slowly, almost as if talking to herself. "I could tell she'd be an ally if I needed her." Then there was Sarah, an old college friend. We'd kept in touch over the years, and there'd always been something more there, unspoken but understood. I reached out to her and laid it all out. I didn't know what I expected, just that I needed someone else on my side. She was there, ready to help. "Let me be there for you," she said softly, her voice warm in a way I hadn't heard in a long time. That's when my plan shifted into something more. She agreed to meet me at a cabin I'd rented, far enough out that we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. When our anniversary rolled around, I kept up the act. I suggested a romantic nature retreat, just the two of us to celebrate. She looked surprised but pleased, thinking she'd pulled the wool over my eyes. I gritted my teeth during the drive, reminding myself that she'd broken every vow she'd ever made to me. It was time for her to face the music. That night we had dinner in the cabin, just the two of us. For a moment it felt almost normal, like we were that couple from years ago. But as she poured herself some wine and talked about our future, I couldn't keep quiet. I threw out a few casual questions, each one with a sharp edge, watching her carefully. I asked how work was going, mentioned her relaxation days, each question landing like a jab. She tried to laugh it off, but I saw her hand tighten around her glass, that flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. It was like she knew something was up but couldn't quite place it. Finally, I excused myself, stepping out long enough for Sarah to slip into the cabin and settle into the back room. I returned, giving Lila just enough time to let her guard down, to feel secure. She looked at me, a touch of irritation in her voice, and said, "You look distant." I didn't respond. Instead, I got up and walked toward the back room, leaving her to sit there in confusion. Sarah was waiting, and we sat close, just as we'd planned, in plain view for Lila when she inevitably followed. I didn't have to wait long. Moments later, Lila stormed in, her face twisted in shock and rage. "What the hell is going on?" she demanded, her voice shrill. I'd expected her to be angry, but seeing her smugness wiped off her face was more satisfying than I'd imagined. "What's going on?" I said, keeping my voice calm. "Oh, I think you know exactly what's going on. You want to talk about betrayal? Let's talk about yours first." I held up the stack of evidence, the photos, the bank statements, the video, everything. "Recognize any of this?" She went pale, her mouth opening and closing as she fumbled for words. She stammered something about feeling stressed, needing comfort, but I cut her off. "Comfort?" I scoffed. "I thought that's what marriage was supposed to be for. But I guess I was wrong." I watched as her anger dissolved, her face crumbling into desperation. She tried to justify herself, saying it wasn't serious, that she'd been lonely, but her excuses sounded as empty as her loyalty. I let her ramble, watching her fall apart right there. When she finally stopped, I shook my head. "You threw it all away, Lila. Every bit of trust, everything we built. I hope he was worth it." With that, I turned and walked out with Sarah, leaving Lila alone with the ruins of her lies. Getting into the car, I felt a strange calm, a quiet satisfaction that I hadn't known in a long time. I didn't look back. The next day, Lila's desperation became almost embarrassing. Call after call, voicemail after voicemail. I watched the screen light up, each ring a reminder of her betrayal. At first, I ignored it all, letting her sit with the weight of what she'd done. But after hours of constant calls, I decided to meet her. I wanted to see her squirm, to watch her lie to my face one last time. When I walked into the cafe, she was already there, sitting at a corner table with red-rimmed eyes and smudged makeup. She looked up, a flash of hope in her eyes, but I kept my face blank, offering her no comfort. I just nodded and sat across from her, waiting for her to speak. Let her try to explain. I wasn't about to make it easy. "Daniel, please," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "I know I made mistakes." "Mistakes?" I echoed coldly. Interesting choice of words. She tried to stumble through an apology, her voice wavering, each excuse flimsier than the last. But I didn't respond, didn't flinch. Finally, when she realized I wasn't buying it, her shoulders slumped, and she fell silent. I stood up, leaving her with her own regrets and guilt. As I walked out, I felt an odd sense of freedom. The chapter was closed, and this time I was the one leaving her behind. "Daniel, please," she whispered, her voice barely above a murmur. "I know I made mistakes." "Mistakes?" I repeated, leaning back in my chair, letting the word hang between us. Interesting choice of words. She flinched, but she pushed on, launching into some flimsy explanation about feeling lost, needing comfort. She spoke as though that somehow justified months of lies, like it could make her deceit acceptable. I didn't respond. I just locked my gaze on her, making sure she saw the disgust on my face. I watched her stumble through her excuses, refusing to give her any ground. "It wasn't serious," she whispered, her voice barely holding. "Marco was just a distraction." "A distraction?" I echoed, my tone flat as a stone. "Funny, I thought marriage was supposed to be more than that. But if distractions are your thing, I just hope it was worth it." She didn't like that. I watched her shift, her gaze hardening, now trying to put some of this on me. "Daniel, you haven't exactly been present," she said, a note of accusation slipping in. "You're always at work, constantly busy, focused on everything except me." "Focused on work?" I let out a cold, humorless laugh, the sound surprising even me. "Is that supposed to be my fault? All those late nights, all that effort, that was for us, for our future. But I guess that just wasn't good enough for you." She looked down, biting her lip, but I wasn't finished. I went through it all, the sacrifices I'd made, the countless ways I'd put her needs ahead of my own. She squirmed in her seat, clearly uncomfortable, but I wasn't about to let her off easy. "You wanted more attention?" I said, voice sharp. "Try being a wife first. You didn't need a distraction. You wanted out." For the first time, she was silent, her face twisting with guilt and anger. She wasn't used to being called out like this, to being forced to confront her own actions. And honestly, I felt a grim satisfaction watching her finally squirm under the weight of her own lies. Then she tried a different angle, bringing up Justin, one of her closest friends, the guy who'd always defended her. "You should talk to Justin," she said, almost pleading. "He knows me. He understands." I almost laughed. Justin? The same guy who'd told me to give her more space, the one who saw her as some flawless, misunderstood woman? Fine. If she wanted me to talk to him, I would. So a few days later, I met up with Justin and laid it all out. I told him everything. The affair, the confrontation, the financial lies, all the deceit. He sat there, stunned, and I saw a flicker of pity cross his face. He finally understood the depth of her betrayal. His expression shifted from disbelief to shame, and I could see that even he was starting to pull away from her. Her most loyal friend was beginning to see her for who she truly was. With Justin's illusions shattered, I turned my attention to the legal side. I'd hired Clara, a lawyer with a reputation for being ruthless. She wasn't interested in small talk, only in the facts, and I appreciated that. I laid out every twisted detail, every receipt, every betrayal. She listened, nodding calmly, taking notes, and when I finished, she looked up with a slight smile. "You have a solid case," she said simply, her voice steady. "She hasn't just broken your trust. She's misused your finances. We can use that." Clara encouraged me to document every single expense, to gather a record of every penny Lila had spent. It was strangely therapeutic, combing through our finances, knowing that each transaction was one step closer to justice. Around this time, I reached out to Grace, an old friend of Lila's who I hadn't expected to take my side. But when she heard about the affair, her attitude shifted completely. Grace was well-connected, knew everyone in our social circle, and had a knack for spreading the word subtly. Soon, Lila was quietly being excluded from gatherings, events, even the brunches where she'd once been the center of attention. Grace never told anyone directly, but whispers spread. It was strangely satisfying watching Lila's friends slowly drift away, her lies catching up with her. Finally, the day came when I filed for divorce. I thought Lila had braced herself for it, but the look on her face when her lawyer handed her the papers told me otherwise. It was only then, I think, that she realized this was real, that there were actual consequences. I made it clear through Clara that this wouldn't be a peaceful, amicable split. There was no way she'd be walking away with half of everything I'd worked for. Clara was relentless, going through every loophole to make sure I retained the house, the savings, and most of our assets. Lila had not only betrayed me, but she tried to take advantage of everything I'd built. I wasn't about to let her get away with that. Clara also suggested digging even deeper into our finances, so I went through years of old receipts and records. What I found only fueled my anger. She'd been spending our money on extravagant dinners, designer clothes, weekend trips, things she'd claimed were for self-care. And I could only imagine what she'd spent on Marco, hiding it all under vague expenses. Seeing it all laid out, the full extent of her betrayal brought it home. This wasn't just infidelity. It was financial abuse, plain and simple. Each charge, each receipt became a weapon in court. And that's when I knew. I'd have my day, and she'd feel every bit of what she'd done. The social fallout for Lila was brutal. News of her affair spread quickly, thanks to Grace's strategic whispers, and the impact was immediate. Friends who'd once adored her started pulling back, their conversations becoming whispers behind closed doors. It was like watching a slow-motion unraveling, and I couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. She'd thrown away our marriage for a fling, and now, piece by piece, her world was abandoning her. I'd see her at events we used to attend together, brunches and gatherings where she'd once been the life of the party, now tense and silent as her former friends avoided her. I could see the pain in her eyes, the desperate way she tried to engage people who no longer wanted her company. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't find some peace in watching her discomfort, a salve for the wounds she'd left in me. Meanwhile, as Lila's world fell apart, I began to find solid ground again. Predictably, Marco started slipping away as her finances dwindled. Once he saw her money drying up, he found wealthier clients, and she was left high and dry. It was poetic justice. She'd gambled everything on him, and now he was ghosting her. I could only imagine the realization sinking in for her, knowing that the man she'd chosen over our marriage had only been interested in her wallet. In contrast, I was surrounded by people who truly cared. My friends and family were there in ways I hadn't expected, supporting me, reminding me of the good still in my life. Jack and Diane, an older couple we'd known for years, became my rock. They invited me over, offered a listening ear, and encouraged me to let go. With their help, I started feeling like myself again. They introduced me to new people, shared fresh perspectives, and gradually, I began to emerge from the shadows of betrayal. Then came Rachel. At one of Jack and Diane's gatherings, I met her, a friend of Grace's, also recently out of a painful breakup. She was easy to talk to, genuine, and understood betrayal on a level that few people could. We connected in a way that felt natural, two people who'd walked similar paths. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of excitement, a sense of hope about the future. With Rachel's friendship and the unwavering support of those around me, I was ready to rebuild. It wasn't just about moving on. It was about creating a life that was entirely my own, free from the weight of lies and deceit. I felt the darkness lifting, and for the first time in years, I was looking ahead with strength and optimism. Months later, Lila reached out again, her tone filled with desperation, hoping for some form of closure. I almost laughed. She'd lost her friends, her stability, and the money she'd counted on, and now she wanted to explain herself? I agreed to meet her, but this time I wasn't angry. This time I had nothing left to lose. At the cafe, I listened as she stumbled through apologies and excuses, watching her face as she tried to explain away her choices. And right there, I realized I had finally moved on. I stood up, leaving her with the weight of her own regrets and guilt. As I walked out, I felt lighter. The chapter was finally closed, and this time I was walking away with my head held high. At one of those gatherings, I met Rachel, a friend of Grace's who had also recently come out of a breakup. We immediately clicked, bonding over the shared experience of betrayal and heartbreak. Our conversations had a depth that was new to me, an understanding that only someone who had walked the same painful road could offer. Rachel was genuine and easy to be around, and for the first time since my life had gone sideways, I felt a flicker of excitement about what lay ahead. As the divorce continued, each financial win in court felt like a step closer to reclaiming my life. Clara, relentless as ever, took Lila's case apart, point by point, using every scrap of evidence we'd gathered to secure a favorable outcome. I kept the house, held onto my assets, and, most importantly, came through with my dignity intact. Watching Clara work was empowering. Her confidence spilled over, renewing my own. Lila's dreams of a payout fell apart with each ruling in my favor, and with every legal victory, I felt justice closing in. But when it was all over, a strange emptiness lingered. I had won, hadn't I? I had regained control, defended my pride, secured my future, but somehow it felt hollow. Lila's downfall didn't feel like a victory. It left a bitter aftertaste. I'd fought so hard for what I had, yet in the process, I'd lost more than I realized. My marriage, my trust in others, and a piece of myself. During those reflective weeks, I realized I needed to reconnect with the world outside the pain. I reached out to friends, dived into hobbies I'd ignored, and picked up projects I'd left by the wayside during the worst of the turmoil. I even started exercising again, rediscovering the satisfaction of pushing myself, feeling the rush as I ran or lifted weights. Bit by bit, I reclaimed parts of my identity that I'd let slip away in the fog of hurt and bitterness. With each passing day, I learned to look forward instead of looking back. Rachel became an important part of this new chapter, cheering me on as I pieced my life back together. With her encouragement and the support of friends, I felt ready to embrace what came next. This wasn't just about moving on. It was about starting over, building a life that was truly mine, free from the weight of betrayal. I found a strange peace in the chaos, realizing that while Lila had tried to tear down our life, I still had the power to build something better on my terms. I was ready to step into the light, leaving the shadows of deception behind, finally moving forward. With the divorce finalized, I felt a curious mix of relief and anticipation. It was time to fully step into my new life, to finally shake off the remnants of my past, and look toward a future that felt open and promising. I knew there would still be challenges, but for the first time in years I felt hopeful. I started with small changes, things that helped me reconnect with who I was before the marriage. I took up guitar lessons, joined a cooking class, and even tried my hand at woodworking on the weekends. Each new experience felt like rediscovering parts of myself that Lila's deceit had overshadowed. I even booked a solo trip I'd always dreamed about, an adventure through the national parks, something I'd promised myself I'd do one day. The thought of hiking through majestic landscapes, breathing in the fresh mountain air, felt liberating. I was finally doing something solely for myself. Rachel became an essential part of this journey. Our friendship blossomed into something deeper, grounded in respect and understanding. She encouraged me to venture outside my comfort zone, nudging me to try new things. We started hiking together, finding trails that opened up to incredible vistas. I'll never forget one hike in particular. We reached a summit just as the sun was setting, casting brilliant shades of orange and purple across the sky. Standing there with her, I felt a surge of gratitude for the beauty I'd overlooked for so long. We also signed up for pottery classes and cooking workshops, where we laughed our way through our attempts to create something halfway decent. Those moments, filled with laughter and a simple joy in creating, were healing. Slowly, I found myself falling for her, and this time, it was different. No games, no lies, just two people who understood each other's wounds and wanted to build something real together. Then, out of nowhere, I got a message from Lila. It had been months since we'd spoken. She reached out seeking closure, her words tinged with a kind of desperation I hadn't expected. She was living in a modest apartment, working a low-paying job, facing the reality of her choices. Her message was part apology, part explanation, a clumsy attempt to find her way back into my life. Reading it, I felt a mix of emotions I hadn't anticipated. Part of me wanted to lash out, to remind her of all the pain she'd caused, but I took a deep breath and decided to respond with the calm I'd gained in these months. I gave her polite closure, explaining that I had moved on and was happy. I wished her well but made it clear that there was no chance of rekindling anything. It felt good to respond without bitterness, to own my decisions and leave her in the past. With summer approaching, I decided to celebrate this fresh start. I organized a gathering at my house, inviting all the people who had stood by me through this journey. Clara, Grace, Jack, Diane, and, of course, Rachel. I wanted to express my gratitude, to thank each of them for helping me find my way through the darkest times. The evening was warm and filled with laughter, a sense of ease and happiness I hadn't felt in years. I shared my story, my rebuilding process, and how much each of them had meant to me in finding a new way forward. It was a cathartic moment, a chance to acknowledge how their support had carried me through. Then, with a nervous breath, I introduced Rachel as my partner. The room erupted in cheers, and as we all raised our glasses to toast new beginnings, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. This was the life I had been waiting for, surrounded by people who truly cared. Looking around, I felt lighter, free of the weight of betrayal that had once held me down. I was stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever life had in store. In the weeks that followed, I immersed myself in passions I'd set aside, traveling, exploring, deepening my relationship with Rachel. Each day, the shadows of the past lifted a little more, and I felt less like a victim and more like a survivor. I had taken the ashes of a broken marriage and turned them into something beautiful. Reflecting on my journey, I marveled at how far I'd come. The path hadn't been easy, but each step had brought me to this moment. A life filled with hope, joy, and a renewed sense of purpose. The past was firmly behind me, and before me lay a blank canvas, a new story to write on my terms.